Welcome to Horizons of Thought. Today I'm going to discuss the interaction between diversity of thought and societal complexity. Early human populations would have formed together into bands of about 70 people, grandparents, parents, children, aunts, uncles, all related. When people wanted to make decisions, they would discuss them and talk to them amongst each other, whether they're going to move their camp, where they're going to find new hunting grounds, whether they're going to add new stories to the narrative, the shared narrative that they all have. They're going to talk to each other. And they're going to talk until everybody either agrees or they abandon the idea. Because unanimity was considered extremely important. We know this from analogs to modern small band societies today all over the world. The views of each person in the group is important, and it's necessary that they agree with each other so that the society can keep on having a shared narrative. What then happens when the society can't have a shared narrative? When one or a small group of people in this band decide that their views are just going to be different than the rest of the group. It could be that the elders would discipline them. It could be that they would just be exiled and they would go off and they would form their own band. There have also been many cases in history where they're simply executed for deviating from the standard narrative that's inside the group. This, if you look through history, it's all over the place. Some of the cruelest and most awful forms of execution that have ever been developed in human history have been developed in order to punish those who deviate from the narrative that's shared in their society. But, and this has also happened many times in history, sometimes that group is very, very convincing and very powerful, and everyone else in the band will convert to the new point of view. If you want to see an example of this well done in a movie, watch the movie Black Robe, where you can see a Jesuit priest who very much loved the group he was working with and whom everybody in the group believed loved him. They all decided that they would convert to Christianity. The story is very sad, though, because the group was killed 13 years later because those around them could not handle the change in narrative so much, felt them to be weak, and destroyed them. Also, a casual study of history will show this has happened a lot whenever a group changes their views enough. Neighbors may not necessarily react well to it. However, not all societies stayed small groups. Today we live in these incredibly gigantic and incredibly pluralistic societies. And the first way we got there was by having technology that allowed us to feed ourselves that was considerably more complex than hunting and gathering. Whenever you have farming or whaling or herding, you can end up in a situation where you produce much more food than you need just to survive. And this allows you to have some people who specialize, and they specialize into various tasks like thinking about philosophy, or being witch doctors, or being clerics of some religion, or being some bureaucratic hierarchy that helps organize things and continue to improve the efficiency. And as this happens in societies, they grow big enough that not everybody can share their narrative anymore. You end up with a few people who gain power. The first way that people gain power is through simple competency. Are you a very good hunter? Are you very good at finding new village sites? You can find yourself understanding this when you're young. What does a small society do in the face of that? You can actually just make sure that these young people realize that the elders are the ones who still have the power in the end, and teach them to be humble and wait until they're older before they gain that power as the new revered elders. But you can also create a situation where these young people gain power for themselves by virtue of this competence that they have. These big men end up ruling over larger groups and having some authority over them, although at this particular point societies are still often much more egalitarian and people still do whatever they want when those in power give them orders. But you've already got the beginning of a change in hierarchies based on competencies. In larger societies, this shows up in the early formation of caste systems, as in the Indus Valley region, where people who are good at doing art, do art. People who are good at military activity, do military activity. People who are good at administrating, do administration activities. But in many societies, over time, this becomes codified. It isn't defined anymore by who's good at the task, but who is born to the people who are good at the task. This is how you get permanent caste systems in India today. This is how you've gotten divisions between the plebs and the patricians in ancient Rome. This is how you get monarchical systems all over the world, where you have peasants at the bottom and nobles at the top throughout the world. And inside systems like that, those who rule and those who have the power eventually get to make decisions. And those who don't rule and don't have the power, they may still have a say, but they don't have as big a say, and their decisions don't matter as much. And so what you end up with in a system like that is a group of people running the show who don't really have to listen to the opinions of everybody anymore, because they don't have to make sure that we all share in our views. They don't have to fight for anonymity. And as a result, you can end up with a whole lot of people who don't have a lot of power, who are very angry about the situation they're in. They don't agree with what the rulers believe. They don't share the same narrative. And the response of rulers throughout history has often been very violent, to suppress their right to speak, to execute people who try to disagree with them, to exile them, to give them very difficult jobs, you name it. But the response of those who find themselves no longer able to share what they view freely is to speak in codes, to speak quietly, to organize away from the prying eyes of those who have power, and to prepare themselves for potential rebellions. And again, human history is complete. It's replete and filled with all sorts of civil wars and rebellions and violence, clashes of people who disagreed with each other over economic issues, over religious issues, over social issues. It is not necessarily the most common form of warfare, since that's almost certainly simple armed robbery, groups of people trying to steal from each other, but it is a common form of warfare. And as societies get very, very large, you end up risking being an internal civil war when you have lots of different points of view. So when you're dealing with really large state societies, like you ended up having formed in Europe, that had lots and lots of different groups in them, and were going out to do various forms of conquest and colonialization, encountering lots of different people, they were running into a very serious threat to the existence of these societies. And some of them started to form a very radical idea. Why don't we in some ways return to the way things used to be? We should have a freedom of speech, a freedom of association, where people are allowed to have their views and discuss them openly, as long as they don't ask for violence, and as long as they're not exceptionally cruel to each other. We can open up the floor to public debate and public forum, much like happened in ancient Greece, much like happens in most very small-scale societies, where people are still going to discuss back and forth before they alter their narrative. The difference is, in these large societies, these discussions don't have to lead in a unity of narrative. They're just an opportunity for people to form their own groups of association while publicly knowing about the others. And so that is one of the fundamental benefits of having freedom of speech, that you can live in a society where people can disagree with each other substantially and do so in a non-violent way, where they can understand what each other has to say, even if they don't like it. But now we're living in a world where we're getting an even bigger change. A person like me can have a cell phone, a small microphone attached to the cell phone pointing at him, a little selfie light which is showing up in the eyeglass over here, and a nice room that's lit up by natural light. I can do a recording. I can edit the recording using free open source software like Blender. I can put that up on YouTube, which has essentially reduced the cost of distribution to zero. And I can have my opinion heard in the whole world. And you can too, for not a whole lot of money. A lot of people can afford the equipment that I'm using. So all over the world, people put up whatever it is that they're thinking on channels like YouTube and Vimeo and Library and many other channels that exist out there, in order to disseminate what it is that they view about the world. But there are so many different views that are being disseminated about the world. Some of them so offensive to other people watching YouTube and watching Vimeo and looking at library that there has been quite a lot of push in our society to get rid of the more undesirable voices on these channels. This particular push is a return to what happened more in early and mid-state societies and what still happens all over the world today, where you basically make sure that those who have power and those who have control over the legal system prevent those who don't have power and control over the legal system from having their voices heard. The danger of that is it also will ultimately lead to a return to the violence that we've seen and in fact are seeing in the world today, where people get so sick of not having their views heard and get so sick of not having a say in their society that they rise up to violence. And so it is my hope to encourage people here to pay attention to each other, to continue to learn from each other, to keep the dialogue open, no matter how difficult it is to hear people they disagree with, so that we can have a peaceful and civil society continue long into the future. And with that, thank you very much for coming here and listening to Horizons of Thought on this topic on diversity and social complexity. If you are interested in contributing to this channel, click on the donor box below and subscribe to the donor box. If you want to share this channel, click on subscribe on YouTube and hit the bell so you get notifications. And I will see you next week. Thank you.